in a certain restroom, to be able to go into a particular restaurant, you have them because of what my people did in this country. And here's another issue that I have is Muslims, we sometimes appropriate or usurp first from our people. And it's part because of ignorance, because we don't know history. We don't know things. And so what happens is we may appropriate certain things and say, yeah, this the first masjid in Houston was the one on such and such drive, when it wasn't. Right? Or the first person to speak before the U.S. Senate was such and such. Or to make a dua before the U.S. Senate when it was such and such, when it was Imam Warthaddin Muhammad. Opening doors, right? And there are people who will tell you, stay away from that community. Stay away from African American Muslims. Or African Americans, period. Wallahi. That's it.
Bismillah. I'm going to apologize in advance that I'm going to be a bit more honest, and I think we might be ready to be honest. I feel like the way that we're talking about us and you and we and them, I almost hear a tendency for black Americans to talk about themselves as a minority amongst Muslims in America, which is just a demographic and statistical fallacy. The largest body of Muslims in America are black American Muslims. So if you want to talk about us, meaning Muslims, if your faith is a basis upon which you are thinking of yourself, the largest body of people in America that are also adherents to that faith are black people. So then, as black Americans, why have we allowed the otherization, the insensitivity, the predatory attitudes that may be sometimes found amongst immigrant Muslim communities? Why have we allowed ourselves to be backed into the corner to feel like we need to somehow justify ourselves, get a tip of the hat, get recognition from the so-called immigrant Muslim community, unless we have drank the Kool-Aid of ourselves as a minority as Muslims in America? And I say that lovingly. I'm saying this amongst family. And I don't want to have to apologize about how we're talking about it. And therein lies the lesson. What lesson would you offer? And what I really had wanted to say earlier when we talk about the fringes is we talk about the influence of Islam in the African American community. There's a bigger question that people are afraid to ask, and that is, what is the influence of the African American experience on Islam? And that's a question that most people, the box is too thick for people to even think about that. And I'm not talking about influence on the Quran or the example of the Prophet, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him. I'm talking about the African American experience on Islam as a shared human enterprise of being Muslim in the world, and what has that had, what influence has it had? You talked about Nigeria or Chinese or this or that. I have an Indonesian friend who grew up in Jakarta, and he said when Muhammad Ali was fighting, the streets of Jakarta were empty because everyone was at home watching Muhammad Ali fight. So Indonesia, which again another fallacy, where are the majority of Muslims from? The Middle East, right? Arab countries, right? Wrong. They're from Southeast Asia. But in Jakarta, people were watching Muhammad Ali. Right now, Muslims from all over the world know about Dave Chappelle, know about Mike Tyson. I was in the gym the other day, and there was a song that came on, I don't remember what it was, where Q-Tip and Janet Jackson did this gig together. Ma'alesh, I know Muslims like to pretend like they don't listen to music. Huh? You guys know the song I'm talking about. And it was just playing in the background. I thought to myself, subhanAllah, Tip is Muslim, and Janet's not Muslim. Tip is Muslim, Q-Tip is Muslim, and Janet is not Muslim. But people say, Wallahu alam. How come you don't say Wallahu alam to all the other Muslims in the world? Why is it that, when Michael became Muslim or when Janet is Muslim, for sure Jermaine is Muslim, why is it Allahu alam? But every other Muslim, you're like, no, we just have to accept it on the outward that they said the Shahada. So what does it mean that some of the greatest icons, and you talk about jazz musician and the Ahmadiyya, there's an opinion that when Coltrane wrote A Love Supreme, it was originally Allah Supreme. And then he had to change it to A Love Supreme because of pressure from the industry. So even people as high up the food chain in jazz music as Coltrane, the spirit of love of God and that was being influenced by Islam and the way that Muslims here in America and black people in America were influenced in that experience was in mainstream culture back then. And it goes deeper. You talked about Bilal. What do we know Bilal as? Bilal was what to the Prophet? What was his job? He was the first treasurer of Baytul Mal. He was the first treasurer in Islam. So even that, we adopt what? Brother, you converted to Islam, mashallah. Black people can sing good. Why don't you make the adhan? And we'll give you the name Bilal. Do you see how we have accepted false narratives even about ourselves? And this is what I'm saying, is that like when you talk about what lesson do you take, it's a lesson of the ability for a person to self-define and self-authenticate. And anybody, whether they're Muslim, white, black, purple, they could be a Martian, you need to be able to self-authenticate, self-identify and self-authenticate. That we don't need to be authenticated by any dominant group, any dominant power, seeing that as a gift from God. And I'll close with the reminder from the Prophet, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him. He said, أَلَا تُنْصَرُونَ وَتُرْزَقُونَ بِدُعَفَائِكُمْ وَفُقَرَائِكُمْ. Okay, Khalis, you are given victory and you are provided for because of the weak and the impoverished amongst you. This is from the Prophet. This isn't me. And there's several different variants of the same hadith in the Sahih. He said, you are given victory and you are provided for because of the weak and the disenfranchised or the impoverished amongst you. So what is our source of power according to our Prophet? It is not our own upward mobility outwardly. It is not our power outwardly. It's our ability as a community to serve those amongst us who are disenfranchised, those amongst us who are poor, those amongst us who are needy. So this idea of the first, when you talk about the first masjid in Houston, you're sitting in the first masjid in Houston and people say, well, that doesn't really count. Because on the other nights I might have been doing some shucking and jiving in here and that doesn't really count. That's Allah's wisdom. That's how Allah brought Islam to this country. Before there was people, and look at how beautiful it is. The part that people don't know, and I hope Rabia doesn't get mad at me saying this, I don't know if you're still here, Rabia, running for judge, is that she's married to a brother. I did their wedding. It was the most amazing wedding I ever did. It started out with some like Luther Vandross as they were coming down the aisle, and then it has some like Bhangra Pakistani like wedding music, and then some brother read the Quran, and I thought, subhanAllah, that's our experience. But look at what Allah has done, and Houston has been uniquely blessed in this regard, in my estimation. Allah brings those rivers together. The river of the experience of Muslims coming from historically Muslim countries, so-called immigrants, and the river of the experience of Islam in America here from black people, those rivers merging, that can make a very beautiful ocean. And part of what you said, and then I'll really close, this is only my second strike. You take 3 strikes. You talked about identifying, right? People say, go back to Islam. You go back to Islam. What do you tell them? We're trying our best. We're trying our best to go back to Islam, but it is not a place, right? You Muslims need to just go back to Islam. And then we're trying to tell them. We're trying to tell them, oh, Muslims, go back to Islam, but it is not a place. But if you want to talk about who was here first, was it white people that discovered America? See? So when someone says, go back to Islam, say, hold on. Who was here first? Who was here first? Thank you. Tell it. No, but this is the part, I think this is where our power lies, that we're not really saying this. The narrative that Robert and Rabia represent, the narrative that we represent in this community, and all I'm really trying to say, in short, is let's stop talking about us and them and you and us, and let's just talk about us, we as a community. We as a community. We have to borrow from the power that is the experience of all of the narratives and all of the history. Because it's not only black history that people are sleeping on, it's also the history of the experience of Muslims coming from Muslim majority lands. And not only the good lessons of that experience, but the very difficult, painful moments of what a post-colonial experience can mean. There's a lot to be learned from that, and there's a lot to be gleaned from that experience. So I think that's what it has to do as a Chinese or a Nigerian or a Pakistani Muslim. When someone says, go back to Islam, you say, hold on a second, my co-religionists, and you said my ancestors. See, because it's easy for me as an American Muslim to say to a Pakistani man who's older than me, it's easy for me to call him uncle. Assalamu alaikum, uncle, how are you? And to see it as that. It should be just as easy for young Pakistani, Arab, Afghan, and fill in the blank Muslims in America to see Sister Sakinah as anti-Sakinah and to borrow from the wisdom that is that wisdom of the elders without any conflict at all. And when you have that, then you have the power. You have the power of connectivity. You have the power of connectivity. And to realize what it means to know that Allah gives victory because of the weak and because of the impoverished amongst us. May Allah make it easy for us. Wallahu a'lam wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad alayhi sallam alhamdulillah.
That was deep, brothers. I guess the example of, it was 2003. I started this Muslim comedy tour called Allah Made Me Funny. And it started out as solo, it was just me. And I took some advice from Imam Muhammad. He loved the idea, but he challenged me. He was like, this is a great idea, you should do it. He said, but don't start it in this community. I said, I don't understand. He said, don't start it with our folks. He said, you need to go to Pakistani, Indian, Arab brothers and sisters. He says, because they need help. And I didn't understand. I was like, well, I'm a comedian. I've written for the George Lopez show. I've written for Nickelodeon. I said, why would I go over there and do comedy? Imam, that's like starting over. And he said, are you funny or not? And I was a little ticked, but I couldn't say anything because it was the Imam, you know. What he was telling me was, start a new narrative. It took a couple years. I was still angry, and I remember going to events. You know, I got some doozies. I remember showing up to do stand-up, and Auntie was like, she thought I was the waiter. She was like, can you get me some tea? I was like, after I tell these jokes? But that's real talk. That's what happened. It wasn't always like this. And what I realized now is, like, we were coming out, and a brother came out, his young Indian brother. He's like, Allah made me funny. I saw you when I was 10. I was like, how old are you? He's like, I'm 22. I was like, man, I'm old. But that was his dream, and he said something. He was saying, man, he's like, listen, and I've heard this before. He's like, we had all these scholars out of our community. We got all these imams out of our community. He goes, and we can send them over to Saudi Arabia and da-da-da. And he said, you know what? He said, they won't get as far as you doing that stand-up. You taking this language that we've given you and putting it through your humor. And he said, your job is not to do stand-up. He said, your job is to be a teacher. Which really was a deep thing, because a lot of y'all don't know. I used to be a school teacher. Why you say whoa like that, sis? You said that like that's why the kids can't read. But it reframed something in me, which was that you're all my brothers and sisters. And as much as I love my brothers and sisters in our community, black people, I've learned to love everybody else the same. And that's the journey. All right.
Okay, I have a few bullet points here that I made mention of, and I'm just going to go down and mention each one of them. what important lesson or experience do you want to convey to us about knowing our history? The first one is that I think this is